Hey, what's up everybody? Welcome to another China update where we give you guys the biggest developments coming out of the Middle Kingdom so you're on top of the world's #2 economy. My name is Tony. It has been a crazy week again, but I'm glad to be with you guys now here at the China Update HQ, aka my bedroom. So welcome. I haven't had dinner yet. I'm feeling a little peckish. We're gonna film this. Gonna go have some Japanese or some Korean. I haven't decided. Maybe I'll have both. It's a free country. Well, it's a free country where you guys are. Not so much here. If this is your first time watching this and you're interested in just one or two of the stories, in the description below we've broken it down into chapters. So if you're just interested in, say, the trade war update or the Hong Kong story, you can just click on that below and it will take you to that part of the video and you can watch it. If you like the content and you want to come on board, feel free to subscribe and hit that bell button. We release one of these episodes every week, Saturday morning in the United States, Saturday evening in East Asia, and we would love to have you on board. But whatever you guys do, it would be a massive, massive help if you smash that like button. For the little guys like me, new YouTubers, it is a huge, huge help. It basically tells that algorithm that we've got decent content and we should show it to more people. Otherwise, no one can really see it. So it'd be a massive, massive help if you dig what we're doing here. Now, it's been a huge week for trade. We need to do the US-China update, but also talk about some other trade-related issues in the region. So what we're going to do is discuss the US-China update first, and then touch on trade later in the episode. Let's jump in. First things first, let's talk about the so-called Phase 1 trade agreement. Now, there is still some stuff up in the air, but there are promising signals that things are going forward and that there could be a signed agreement between China and the US by the end of the year. At the beginning of the week, there were signs coming out of China that the Chinese wanted the Americans to acknowledge that they had agreed to reduce some of the tariffs that had been put on Chinese goods in the last year or so. There wasn't much coming out of the White House. Last week we discussed how this could be a problem going forward, especially if the Trump administration never made any such agreements. There were two major stories that the state-run media in China released in English. These stories came from a writer who is known to be very close to Liu He, one of the 4 vice premiers of the People's Republic of China, and the person who has been leading the Chinese trade negotiations with their counterpart, Lighthizer, in the United States. So these stories were seen as very authoritative. Now, it was confirmed on Thursday that both countries have agreed to roll back existing tariffs on each other's products. This would suggest that the two sides are, at least on this point, on the same page, and that both sides are moving closer to a real trade deal and getting something in writing and signed by the end of the year. The market reacted very well to it. On Thursday and Friday, there was a jump in the stock markets in the United States. And this news was also coming hot off the heels of a UN report. The UN report concluded that as a direct result of tariffs erected against Chinese products from the US side, the Chinese lost $35 billion. So that is quite a hefty price that's been paid on the Chinese side. Now, despite this news on Thursday and the positive reception that it received on Wall Street, there are still a couple of points that are up in the air. For example, what exactly is going to be rolled back? Which tariffs on which products? How much? How is it going to be implemented? There's still the question of where exactly this agreement is going to be signed. The White House has indicated that perhaps it will happen in a farming state in the United States. That idea was toyed around with, but nothing like that has been confirmed. And of course, there is still the issue of how much exactly did the Chinese agree to buy from the United States in terms of agricultural purchases. We discussed this in the last episode, but this could potentially be a sticking point, especially considering the Chinese side is unlikely going to be able to purchase pre-trade war levels of agricultural purchases, let alone the 40 to 50 billion that the Trump administration claims was agreed to. So that stuff is still up in the air as well. Hey guys, good morning. I just woke up. It's Saturday morning in Asia, East Asia. So there's been an important update overnight. So I'm just going to insert this in the video because it is salient to this story. So on Thursday, like I said earlier, on Thursday it was said that the American side had agreed to roll the tariffs back. Now, I've woken up on Saturday morning and Trump has said to reporters just about an hour ago, Friday afternoon in the US, that he had not agreed to roll any tariffs back. So that's an important statement because it's contrary to what the Chinese claimed on Thursday. So what does this mean? Well, this means that this idea of tariff reduction in exchange for the Phase 1 trade agreement, this is still a sticking point. It doesn't necessarily mean that the agreement has failed, though. I think that this is a negotiating tactic on both sides. Now, it's important that we that we look at the language that was used. So I've got the quotes here. So Trump said, quote, "They'd like to have a rollback. I haven't agreed to anything," unquote. So that sort of language is quite open-ended. It suggests that the president's not angry and say there's no way that's going to happen, etc. He's saying, I haven't agreed to anything. So it sounds like it's a negotiating tactic. Now, the Chinese language is also important. Now, we've already discussed those statements that were made by the writer connected to Liu He, the vice premier and chief negotiator on the Chinese side. But on Thursday, I think it's better to look at the clearer official statements that were made by Gao Feng, who is the foreign ministry spokesperson of the People's Republic of China. So this is what he said on Thursday. If China and the US reach a phase 1 deal, both sides should roll back existing additional tariffs in the same proportion simultaneously. It's worth noting in Chinese, should here is more like must, like it's a conditional thing. I do believe that the Americans have more leverage in this case. I think the Chinese need this deal more than the Americans do, but the Trump administration does want to get some sort of deal across the line. So what we're probably going to see is more behind the scenes negotiations, and maybe there'll be some reduction in tariffs on the American side in exchange for a concession on the Chinese side. But I promise whatever happens, I will continue to update you all. Now, I'm going to go get a coffee. Okay guys, now let's talk about Hong Kong. Now, I'm not going to touch too much on the economy, but there were some stories coming out discussing how a recession is likely going to deepen in Hong Kong. You can check out our last episode from last week where we discussed this a little bit more in detail, the economic effects of the recent protests, what that means for the currency, the financial sector, and the wider economy in Hong Kong and in China. But this week there have been some political developments that we need to discuss. Carrie Lam, the chief executive of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region of the PRC, went to the mainland of the PRC this week to meet with the big man himself, Xi Jinping. There was a happy photo with the two big smiles all around. She also met with Han Zheng, who is one of the 4 vice premiers of the People's Republic of China, who is in charge of Hong Kong affairs. Now, this is an interesting development because people who have watched this before would know a few weeks ago, we reported on rumors that were being reported in Western media that Beijing was thinking of replacing Carrie Lam with another candidate sometime early next year and finishing out Carrie Lam's post. Now, at the time, Beijing denied these rumors, calling them just that, rumors that had alternative motives. Well, now it's still possible that Beijing plans to replace Carrie Lam next year, but this seems less likely now that she's received such a warm, smiley, and public reception. So what does Beijing have planned for Hong Kong? Well, South China Morning Post had a very interesting article this week where they were quoting a top government aide or a top government advisor in Beijing. It's reported that this person said that the position of Beijing is that Hong Kong has a constitutional duty to pass local laws to protect against threats to national security. Now here, threats to national security is not really referring to terrorism, but separatism. So it seems that Beijing is likely going to put a lot of pressure on the Hong Kong government to pass laws that are going to undermine some of the political freedoms in place that are allowing for the protests and everything now. There's also been several high-profile reports quoting sources that suggest that the government wants to push patriotic education in Hong Kong going forward. And so these are some of the changes that we're going to see post-protests. By the way, guys, if you want to know what VPN I use in China to get over the Great Firewall of China and why I believe everyone, whether in China or in the West, should use a VPN, you can check out my reasoning in the description below. Okay, guys, now let's talk trade. So there's been a lot of big trade developments this week regarding China. For example, Macron, is that how you say it? The French guy? Macron? There's a h in there somewhere, I think. Anyway, Macron, the president of France, announced a big $15 billion trade deal with the Chinese side. Good job, France. My home country of New Zealand upgraded our free trade agreement with the People's Republic of China, making our trade relationship the most liberalized trade relationship with China out of any Western developed economy. Good job, New Zealand. And China hosted the second China International Import Expo, which they made a big deal about and said, we're open for business, come and trade with us, we import a lot, which is sort of true. I don't know how open for business they are. They're still sort of working on that, but they are a large import market. And a large reason why the Chinese import so much is because they assemble products. So it's not so much that they're adding a lot of value or producing a lot and then exporting it. They're not as big a driver of global growth as they may want you to think. In fact, the largest driver of growth is still the largest consumer market and the largest capital market, and that is, of course, the United States. Chinese certainly do import a lot from a few countries that enjoy a trade surplus with China, for example, Australia or Brazil or New Zealand, my country, and a few other countries that provide raw resources for their building boom and their infrastructure spending. But outside of that, it's assembly and re-export, and most countries in the world have a trade deficit with China. But the big trade story had to do with RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is a massive regional deal between China, Japan, Korea, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, India, Australia, and New Zealand. Let's take a step back and do a little bit of geography and history. During the Obama administration, one of the major policy changes that was implemented was the so-called pivot to Asia. Basically, the American attention was moving away from the Middle East and Europe and towards Asia. They said these are large emerging markets and the Americans needed to have a greater focus on that region. They would later change the name from the pivot to the rebalancing. But the Chinese didn't really see it that way. From the Chinese perspective in Beijing, they saw this as an attempt to hold China down. Now, the crown jewel in Obama's pivot or rebalancing to Asia was the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I'm sure you have heard of it. This was, of course, a very controversial trade agreement that was going to be signed amongst a dozen or so developing and developed countries, including Japan, Australia, Vietnam, Chile, and the United States, amongst others. And it's the very same trade agreement that President Trump withdrew the United States from during his first week in office through executive order. Now, in response to the pivot, the Chinese got involved with RCEP, which was already underway. Now, RCEP is also a very large agreement, but it is not as comprehensive as TPP. Some of the most controversial aspects of TPP dealt with so-called behind-the-border trade restrictions. Traditionally, FTAs have basically dealt with at-the-border restrictions like tariffs and quotas and things like that. With the Trans-Pacific Partnership, there was an idea of implementing shared regulatory environments between the trading nations to make it easier to engage in trade, including behind-the-border stuff like IP protections, dealing with procurement with the local government, and most controversially, in developed economies, especially democracies, giving investors certain rights, including the ability to sue the government for breaches of their rights under the trade agreement. Now, RCEP doesn't touch that stuff at all. RCEP is more of an old school trade agreement that is dealing with at-the-border tariff reductions. Now, most of the countries in RCEP are actually already pretty closely tied trade-wise, but the big win for RCEP was bringing India into the fold, because India is a large emerging market with a growing consumer base and very high tariffs. So that brings us to what happened this week. This week, India basically pulled out, or at the very least, India said it could not come on board with the current agreement, an agreement that China was hoping to get across the line this week. The Indians were concerned that their local industries could not stand up to the competition that some of the imports from China especially would bring to their domestic economy. Now, the position now is that all these countries except India are going forward and passing legal provisions that need to be passed in preparation for signing and ratification of this trade agreement with or without India. So it seems, for the moment at least, that there has been a slowdown in the integration between the Indian and the Chinese markets. So last story, let's talk about financial reforms that are happening on the ground at the provincial level in China. As you guys probably know, one of the major reasons the Chinese are facing economic slowdown is because they're going through a deleveraging campaign and have been for about 18 months. This is basically moving from a credit-led growth model to one which is based on consumption and productivity gains. The Chinese have amassed massive amounts of debt, and they need to reverse this trend because it is not a sustainable growth model, and it increases volatility in the financial sector, which increases the risk of collapse. Now, moving away from this credit-run model is very, very hard to pull off. And one of the reasons why that is because of institutional problems at the local level. You see, there's this unholy trinity at the local level. You have local governments, state-run banks, and state-run corporations. The actors in these bodies are all interconnected and have incentives to work together for short-term gains, even if it's at the expense of a sustainable model of growth. Now combine this with corruption, lack of accountability because there's no free press, and good old-fashioned greed and moral hazard from these banks who see themselves as backed by local authorities and thus too big to fail, and you have a situation which is very, very hard to fix. So there have been a few stories this week that are looking at different parts of this issue and how the central government has been trying to respond to it. So what they need to deal with is the local government officials, the banks, and the state-run enterprises. Firstly, it seems that the central government has been sending some of its top financial body bureaucrats to head local governments that have seen particularly acute debt issues over the last few years, or debt accumulation issues over the last few years. Now, this is a recipe that has worked for them before. In the 1990s, where there were similar financial issues at the local level, they sent a lot of players who had come from the financial bureaucracies at the central government level to the provincial level to try and fix some of these issues. Most notably was Wang Qishan, who is now currently the vice president and probably the man behind the throne in terms of Xi Jinping. He did this in the 90s. Now the situation now is much harder than it was in the past. The debt issue is much bigger, economic growth is much slower, and the complexity of the problem is much worse than it was in the 90s and in the 80s before that. So some of these structural issues are not necessarily going to be fixed very easily by bureaucrats coming from Beijing to the local level. Now, issues with the banking sector seems to be much worse. There have been 2 runs on banks this week. There was a couple of nationalizations over the last few months, and there were some big bailouts of big provincial coastal region banks which should have had more liquidity and more stability. But it's difficult to know exactly what's going on behind the scenes. Is this an example of the government losing control, or are they pushing through difficult reforms with some of these banks at the local level, and these are the results? It's getting a little bit messy. On this, we need to just keep an eye on the banking situation, particularly in Zhejiang, Shandong, and Jiangsu, where we're seeing some of these issues manifest themselves. And so now, how are they dealing with the corporations? Well, actually, this could be a good thing. There have been a few reports this week discussing an increase in bankruptcies. Now, you might be asking, Tony, why is this a good thing that there's more bankruptcies? Well, actually, traditionally, a lot of bad debt has been tied into keeping some of these zombie corporations or unproductive state-owned enterprises going. But news that there's been an increase in bankruptcies could actually be a very good thing. It could be suggesting that the government is allowing more bankruptcies to occur, so a lot of this bad debt can be washed out, and you can see hopefully a controlled deleveraging at the local level. This would free up capital in the banking sector to lend to the more productive parts of the economy, i.e. the private parts of the economy, which would be good for growth and for reducing some of those debt burdens at the ground level. Now, there's been a huge increase in specialized bankruptcy courts, similar to the ones that you've seen in the United States, across the country, to take on board this increase in bankruptcy rates. However, don't hold your breath on this. It does seem that the vast majority of state-owned enterprises will still be protected, especially considering that most of the bankruptcies that have been going through the last few months have been entirely in the private sector. So we could actually look back in 6 months and find what was happening was it was really the non-politically connected companies that were being bankrupt, and the ones that were connected got through. And so really it's a form of nationalization. Debt in China is a massive subject, and the institutional issues at the local level is also a big subject. We'll be doing special stories on those in the future, and we hope you enjoy them. But all you need to know is that this unholy trinity exists. The central government is part of its efforts to deleverage, but also part of its wider efforts to increase governance, efficiency, and to increase the role and the power of the central government over the provincial governments, is trying to deal with it. And it's too early to say what the effects of this have been, but I promise to let you guys know when they occur. Okay, thank you so much guys for watching this week's China Update. Make sure you smash that like button if you haven't already, and subscribe so you can keep on top of China every Saturday. I'm Tony, thank you so much. I've decided I'm gonna have Korean, so I'm gonna go have some fried chicken. Thank you so much guys. Have an awesome weekend, and I'll see you next time.